For years, local officials have promised to close the gap between the city's workforce and the diversity of Boston's population. Overall, people of color have become the majority, but they're increasingly outnumbered on the Boston police and fire departments. With an eye toward changing that balance, a community forum will take place on June 20th. Our guest is from one of the groups organizing the forum, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice. We'd like to welcome staff attorney Sophia Hall. Thank you very much for being with us, Sophia.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me.
First of all, talk about the people behind this. It's your group, but some other partners here too, right?
Right. So we are partnering with the Boston chapter of the NAACP, the Vulcans, and MAMLIO to have an open forum so that the community can have an opportunity to discuss their concerns around diversity in public safety agencies and to offer solutions that potentially we haven't thought of yet or that haven't been implemented.
Well, talk about the makeup of the police and fire department right now, because we've covered these events where recruits are sworn in, and certainly it doesn't take much probing to figure out that this is wider than it used to be, if I'm not mistaken. So how did that happen?
Well, I mean, I don't have all the answers. The problem is, at least statistically speaking, the numbers haven't changed much over the last few years. And we're seeing people retire higher in ranks. So that means we're losing some of the diversity that exists while not gaining it on the lower end. So for fire, for example, it's still approximately 74% white. And for police, while we have a cadet program that does have good diversity figures, we need to see those people succeed. And that's just the beginning of the story here. We need to actually talk about what other places, what other areas within the police department can we further diversity.
Well, of course, the other factors in hiring here are civil service, veterans preference, and whether you like them or not, a lot of people say politically it's hard to change something like that.
Everything's a complicated conversation if you want it to be. If you want to look for the barriers and problems, they'll always exist. But the reality is, this isn't something that's important to this city. This is something that's important to this community. They deserve to see themselves reflected back in the agencies that serve them when they're having emergency situations. And so this forum is so that they can have an opportunity to have that conversation. And it's not about barriers, it's about solutions. We, the Lawyers Committee, have issued a letter. We've had multiple conversations with leadership in both of these agencies. And we're really here to talk about not the barriers, but the ways that we can get around this, the way that we can actually prioritize diversity in the way that we believe it should be.
Any ideas that are floating around, at least, about how you can do that?
Yeah, so I mean, we already have the example of the cadet program in the police department, but we'd like to see that happen in the fire department as well. That would really be a huge push, and it would be a demonstration by the city that they are in fact committed to diversity. The other issue that we'd like to see is that residency requirement made longer so that individuals here who live in Boston, who are from Boston, have an opportunity to have that preference when applying for these jobs.
Explain that a little bit more, because a lot of people might assume that all of these white people getting on are real Bostonians, and some of them are, I guess, new Bostonians too, maybe.
That's absolutely true. So at this point, we have a 1-year residency requirement in Boston for both fire and police. And so if you had a 3-year residency requirement, for example, you could have individuals who are more likely to actually be from Boston rather than to have moved here for these jobs to actually get that preference, to get that identification as the individuals that could come up on the list to be hired.
We're talking with Sophia Hall from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice. Sophia, what do we know about the gains from diversity in any workforce, really? But talk about police and fire. Why is it so important?
Well, what we know nationally from last summer is that the tensions between communities of color, police, and fire are real. That it is harder to do a job if you do not have inherent trust in the people that are doing that job. So the community needs to see itself reflected back, not only so that they can feel willing to come forward as victims of crimes or as witnesses to crimes, but also so that they have the ability to communicate. I mean, there are language and cultural barriers that exist that are real, that stop people from being able to do their job efficiently or effectively. In addition to that, I mean, the reality is that all sectors of life should actually reflect the community, and this is just an area where it's most obvious.
Because the other thing that occurs to me is that if you don't have diversity, you only see people in these communities in a crisis scenario, whereas if they're working with you in the office or in a car and in a truck in the street, I guess it's a different story.
I think that's absolutely right, Chris. And, we talk about here in at least the police department being a community police department. And that means that they should actually have those positive relationships. Hopefully they know one another. They know who to go to when they need help. But if it's not reflecting that community, if it's obviously not part of that community, then we can tell that there's some sort of deficit occurring.
We should mention some details about the way this meeting is going to be structured. Any ideas about what people should be expecting or who should be coming to this meeting?
Well, I hope everybody in the Boston community will be coming to this meeting. The more the merrier. I'd hope we have to open the windows and the doors so that they can shout through from the outside. But realistically, this should be an opportunity for their ideas to come present. It's also an opportunity for people who maybe don't know as much about this issue to learn a little bit from some of the people who are actively involved.
And of course, the location here at Mamleo's headquarters is in Columbia Road, Seaver Street, is it, or across from Seaver?
Exactly. So it's right off of Seaver and Columbia Road in Dorchester, Mass.
And at what time does this get started?
5:30 to 7:30 next Tuesday on the 20th.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Sophia Hall from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice. In a moment, new gains for arts education in the Boston Public Schools.